Usually when we talk about international treaties, there's this underlying assumption of permanence.
Right, like it's carved in stone.
Exactly. You know, you build this massive concrete dam, you negotiate the placement of every single piece of rebar, you pour the concrete, and once it's set, you just sort of assume the water is going to stay where it's supposed to stay.
Yeah, you assume it's fixed.
But then you step into the world of international diplomacy, specifically in the Middle East, and suddenly that concrete dam starts looking a lot more like a sandcastle.
It really does. The landscape there is just incredibly volatile.
It is. In fact, between 2017 and 2021, we watched a massive geopolitical dam just collapse entirely. So if you want to understand the chaotic headlines about the United States and Iran today, we really have to look at this specific 4-year window.
Yeah, because that 4-year window is, it is the absolute definition of a structural collapse. We're looking at the total unraveling of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the implementation of what the U.S. called its maximum pressure campaign, and the subsequent slide toward the absolute brink of open conventional war.
And to unpack all of this, we are doing a deep dive into a highly detailed historical dossier that traces U.S.-Iran relations. So we'll be zeroing in on the policy debates, the economic maneuvers, and the military escalations of this exact period.
But before we get into the mechanics of all that, we should probably establish a very clear baseline for you all listening.
Yeah, that's crucial. The sources we're working from contain some sharply contrasting political viewpoints on the nuclear deal, so we just want to make it clear up front, we are not taking a side here.
Right, we aren't endorsing any specific viewpoint.
Exactly. Our mission is strictly to lay out the strategic logic that, both critics and defenders of the deal used during this volatile period.
Yeah, the goal is really just to understand the actual mechanics of what happened on a geopolitical level, rather than trying to, litigate who was morally or politically right or wrong.
So let's set the stage. It's early 2018. We have this painstakingly built nuclear deal in place, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA.
Right.
And the basic premise was that Iran agreed to severe limits on its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of international economic sanctions. So the concrete dam is holding the water.
For a moment, yeah.
But then, in May 2018, President Trump officially withdrew the United States from the JCPOA.
And the timing of that withdrawal is really the first major pivot point here. Because this happened despite international inspectors from the IAEA, the people whose literal job it is to monitor the nuclear facilities.
Right, the actual watchdogs.
Yeah, exactly. It happened despite them certifying that Iran was fully in compliance with the terms of the deal.
Wow.
Yeah, Iran was doing what it agreed to do on paper.
Which naturally sparks this massive debate about why the U.S. would leave an agreement that was technically functioning.
Yeah, exactly.
So, to understand the critics' argument, let's look at the structure of the deal itself. Defenders of the JCPOA were arguing, hey, the agreement is keeping the region safe right now. The inspectors are saying the facilities are locked down.
Which was true.
Right. But critics looked at the deal and saw fatal flaws, specifically pointing to what they called sunset clauses. Can you explain what those actually are?
Yeah, so a sunset clause is essentially just an expiration date.
Okay.
The JCPOA didn't permanently ban Iran from ever having a nuclear program. It just placed strict caps on their activities for specific durations. So like 10 years, 15 years, and so on.
I see.
And critics of the deal argued that because these restrictions would eventually lift, the agreement wasn't a permanent solution. It was basically just kicking the can down the road.
Right.
Furthermore, the critics pointed out that the JCPOA only covered the nuclear program. It completely ignored Iran's development of advanced ballistic missiles, and it ignored their funding of proxy militias across the Middle East.
Okay, so if we go back to the idea of building a structure, it's like the defenders are saying, the house is keeping the rain out today, so let's live in it.
Right.
And the critics are saying, yeah, but the house is built on a land lease that expires in 10 years, and meanwhile, the neighbor is building a fireworks factory in the backyard that isn't covered by the lease. We need to tear this down and negotiate a totally new, comprehensive lease.
That framing actually captures the administration's logic perfectly.
Okay.
They wanted to force Iran back to the negotiating table to get a deal that covered everything.
Right.
So the nuclear program permanently, the ballistic missiles, and the regional militias.
And the tool they chose to force that negotiation was the maximum pressure campaign.
Exactly.
And the stated goal of maximum pressure was to drive Iran's oil exports completely to zero, like absolute zero.
Which is a massive escalation.
Right. So they reimpose all the old U.S. sanctions, but they also deploy something much heavier, which are secondary sanctions. And this is a concept that gets thrown around in the news a lot, but I really want to break down how a secondary sanction actually functions mechanistically.
Yeah, super important to understand.
Because initially, you might think, okay, the U.S. left the deal, but the European Union, Russia, China, they're all still in it.
Right.
So if the international inspectors are explicitly saying, hey, they're following the rules, why can't Iran just trade with the rest of the world? How do secondary sanctions actually force everyone else to go along with the U.S. withdrawal?
Well, it all comes down to the plumbing of the global financial system.
Okay.
A primary sanction is just the U.S. saying American companies cannot do business with Iran.
Which makes sense.
Right. But a secondary sanction is the U.S. saying to the rest of the world, if you do business with Iran, you cannot do business with the United States.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think the best way to visualize this for you listening is to think of the U.S. dollar not just as a currency, but as the actual, operating system of global banking.
That's a great way to put it.
Almost every major cross-border transaction relies on the dollar at some point.
Yeah.
So if a massive French energy company wants to buy Iranian oil, that transaction eventually has to be cleared through a correspondent bank in New York.
And that is exactly the choke point the U.S. government weaponized.
Right.
The U.S. Treasury effectively tells that French energy company or, a German engineering firm or an Asian shipping conglomerate that they have to make a choice.
A very stark choice.
Very stark. They can have access to the Iranian market,
Right.
or they can have access to the American market and the ability to process transactions in U.S. dollars.
And for any multinational corporation, that's not a choice at all.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
The U.S. market is infinitely more valuable.
So even though European governments were politically furious about the U.S. withdrawal and legally encouraged their companies to stay in Iran to, keep the nuclear deal alive, the companies themselves looked at their balance sheets, panicked, and immediately fled Iran.
Yeah, the businesses weren't going to take that risk.
Exactly. Now, the European governments did try to build alternative payment systems, right? Essentially trying to write a new piece of software to bypass the U.S. dollar operating system.
They did. They created a barter mechanism called Instex, so goods could flow without ever touching U.S. dollars.
But it's like Europe tried to build this secret financial tunnel to keep trading with Iran, but because the U.S. effectively controls the global banking water supply, they simply flooded the tunnel.
Yeah, exactly. The failure of Instex is a prime example of the sheer gravity of American financial power. European politicians built this bypass tunnel, but European CEOs just refused to use it.
Because it wasn't worth it.
Right. I mean, a CEO at a major multinational firm isn't going to risk their company's access to Wall Street or the U.S. banking sector just to appease their local politicians' desire to save the Iran deal.
The risk is just too astronomical.
Way too high. So the U.S. successfully used secondary sanctions to effectively flood Europe's financial bypass tunnel.
The money stops completely.
Completely.
And this failure by Europe triggers a major shift in Iran's calculus, because Iran realizes the economic benefits of the deal are totally dead. The promised sanctions relief was an illusion, all because the U.S. could unilaterally shut off global commerce.
Right. So Iran makes its next move.
They stop complying with the deal. They begin systematically breaching the limits, rebuilding their nuclear stockpile, and raising their levels of uranium enrichment. So I have to ask, if Europe couldn't save the deal's economic promises, did Iran start rebuilding its nuclear stockpile purely out of retaliation? Or was this a calculated way to manufacture new leverage?
It was definitely about leverage. And to understand why, we need to look closely at the mechanics of uranium enrichment here, because it really explains the pressure they were trying to apply.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When we talk about enrichment, we're talking about taking uranium gas and spinning it in these massive, high-speed machines called centrifuges. And they do this to separate out a specific, highly reactive isotope, U-235, which is needed for nuclear fission.
And the JCPOA strictly limited both the number of centrifuges Iran could spin and how highly they could enrich the uranium. They were capped at 3.67%, right? Which is, that's just the level you need for a civilian nuclear power plant.
Exactly, just for civilian power. But once the economic pressure from the U.S. became unbearable, Iran started spinning more advanced centrifuges and pushing that enrichment level all the way up to 20%.
Wow.
And what's crucial to understand about the physics of enrichment here is that getting from raw uranium to 3.67% takes massive amounts of time and energy.
Right. It's the hardest part.
Yes. But once you hit 20%, You have done roughly 90% of the mechanical work required to reach the 90% purity needed for an actual nuclear weapon.
Oh, man. So by jumping to 20%, they are drastically shrinking the breakout time, the time it would take them to build a bomb if they sprinted for one.
Exactly.
But this isn't necessarily a mad dash to build a bomb in the dark, is it? It seems more like they are loudly turning the dials on a very dangerous machine so that the West is forced to pay attention.
Yeah, that's spot on. It is absolutely a calculated diplomatic warning signal.
Okay.
You have to remember, Iran was completely starved of its primary revenue source, which was oil, and abandoned by European markets.
Right.
They realized that asking politely wasn't going to get the U.S. sanctions lifted. So they weaponized the only asset they had left. By publicly raising their enrichment levels, they sent a very clear message to Washington and Europe.
Which is basically, fix this or else.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The message was, if we don't get the economic benefits of this deal, you do not get the security benefits.
Yeah.
And look at the math. The clock is ticking a lot faster now.
So the economic vice is tightening, Iran is financially suffocating, their nuclear limits are falling away, and the leverage play isn't working fast enough.
No, it's not.
So as we move into 2019, the conflict fundamentally changes. It can't be contained to bank ledgers in New York or centrifuges in underground laboratories anymore. The pressure spills out into the physical world.
Yeah, the transition from economic warfare to kinetic, physical confrontation is almost inevitable when the pressure reaches that kind of critical mass.
Right.
Because a state backed entirely into a corner economically will eventually lash out physically.
And we really see that lashing out in 2019. We start seeing these mysterious incidents in the Persian Gulf. In May and June of 2019, commercial oil tankers, including, I think, Japanese-owned vessels, they get hit by explosions and sabotage.
Yeah, mine attacks on the hulls.
Right. And then a highly advanced $100 million U.S. military surveillance drone, a Global Hawk, is shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile.
Which was a massive deal at the time.
So why target shipping tankers and unmanned drones? I mean, when I first look at these targets, my instinct is to think of it like the geopolitical equivalent of keying someone's car in the parking lot instead of punching them in the face. You're angry about the economic strangulation, so you commit an act of vandalism that's really annoying, but you're avoiding a direct fight.
I get why you'd see it that way, but I really have to push back on the vandalism analogy because it severely understates the strategic danger here.
Really? How so?
Well, keying a car is petty. Blowing holes in international oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz is directly threatening the central artery of the entire global economy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
This is the architecture of a shadow war. When two states are enemies but desperately want to avoid a full-scale conventional war because that would be devastating for both of them, they engage in this murky, highly deniable space.
Right, so it's all about calculated risks, tit-for-tat escalations.
Exactly. It's a calculated attempt to show the United States and its allies that the pain of maximum pressure is going to be shared.
Ah, I see.
Iran is essentially demonstrating a core threat. Basically, if American sanctions prevent us from exporting our oil through the Persian Gulf, we will make sure nobody else can safely export their oil either.
So they're trying to impose a massive global cost on the maximum pressure campaign.
Precisely.
And what about shooting down the unmanned Global Hawk drone?
That is about actively testing the opponent's red lines.
Okay.
They wanted to figure out exactly what they could get away with before the U.S. responded with overwhelming military force. So they destroyed a massive, ridiculously expensive American asset,
Yeah.
but they very deliberately avoided killing American troops.
Because both sides know that killing uniformed personnel is the universal red line.
Exactly. That's the spark that ignites an all-out conventional war. So it's this incredibly dangerous, very delicate dance of violence.
But the inherent problem with the shadow war of calculated risks is that eventually someone miscalculates.
Right.
The math gets fuzzy, someone pushes a little too hard, and the shadow war is dragged terrifyingly into the light. Which brings us to the tipping point, January 2020.
Yeah, this is the moment the entire strategic framework nearly collapses into open state-on-state conflict.
On January 3, 2020, a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad kills Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah.
Now, for anyone listening who maybe just recognizes the name from passing headlines, we need to define who this man was, because Soleimani wasn't just some guy in a uniform. He was the commander of the Quds Force.
Right, and to really understand the Quds Force Imagine combining the CIA and U.S. Special Forces into a single unit and then directing them to operate entirely outside of their own country's borders.
That's a serious organization.
Absolutely. And Soleimani was the mastermind architect of Iran's entire regional network of proxy militias. So we're talking places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen.
He was essentially a geopolitical nerve center.
Yeah.
So taking him out wasn't a standard battlefield maneuver. The U.S. had targeted militant leaders before, obviously, but assassinating a top-tier state commander, a highly visible and revered figure within Iran's military and political establishment, while he was traveling in a third country, Iraq, that was completely unprecedented in the modern history of U.S.-Iran relations.
Oh, completely. The magnitude of that strike shattered the unwritten rules of the shadow war.
How so?
Well, up until that point, as we were saying, the escalations had been carefully calibrated to remain below the threshold of direct state-on-state conflict.
Right, the drones, the tankers.
Exactly. But the assassination of Soleimani crossed that threshold permanently. It forced Iran into a position where they had to respond openly, not just through their proxies, to save face domestically and basically reestablish deterrence.
And Iran's response is a massive escalation in its own right. On January 8, they launched direct ballistic missile strikes on Al-Assad Air Base, which is a facility housing U.S. military personnel in Iraq.
Right.
They didn't use a proxy militia for this. This was direct fire from Iranian territory onto American troop barracks.
Yeah, undeniable state action.
We went from shooting down unmanned drones in the summer to assassinating a top-tier state commander and launching ballistic missiles in the winter. We are staring over the absolute edge of the cliff here.
Without a doubt.
Because if an Iranian missile hits a crowded mess hall, the U.S. is launching a massive counterattack the next morning, and we're at war.
Oh, immediately.
So how did both sides manage to step back from the brink when the missiles were literally already in the air?
It's crazy, but the mechanics of how they de-escalated are just as fascinating as the escalation itself.
Okay, tell me.
So Iran's ballistic missile response was massive. They fired over a dozen highly accurate missiles, but they simultaneously utilized back-channel diplomacy to ensure the situation didn't actually spiral into World War III.
Wait, how do you have diplomacy when you're actively firing missiles at each other? I mean, the U.S. and Iran don't even have formal diplomatic relations.
They use intermediaries, primarily the Swiss embassy in Tehran, which handles U.S. interests.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so through various indirect channels, warnings were given hours in advance. The Iraqi government was notified, with Iran knowing full well they would pass the warning straight to the Americans. Iran effectively telegraphed the strike.
Oh, so they're essentially saying, we have to fire these missiles to prove we can, and to satisfy the demand for revenge at home, but we're giving you time to get your troops into reinforced bunkers because we don't actually want to kill hundreds of Americans and start a war we can't win.
Exactly. That is the grim calculus of the moment.
Unreal.
They aimed for the bases but sought to minimize the body count. However, you have to understand, the margin for error was practically non-existent.
Because if one missile goes slightly off course.
Exactly. And even with the warnings, dozens of U.S. service members suffered traumatic brain injuries just from the sheer concussive force of the blasts.
Right.
Though remarkably, no one was actually killed. But when we look back at the phrase came to the brink, it is not hyperbole.
Not at all.
The structured, highly technical diplomacy of 2015, the quiet rooms in Vienna, the tedious debates over centrifuge models, that had completely evaporated.
Gone.
In its place was a raw, kinetic military standoff where literally one slightly misaligned missile guidance system could have triggered a regional war.
It is genuinely chilling to trace that line. I mean, let's just distill this entire journey we just went through.
Yeah, let's do it.
We watch a highly structured, internationally monitored agreement give way to a strategy of maximum economic pressure. Then, that economic strangulation led directly to Iran aggressively rebounding its nuclear program to build leverage.
Right.
And when that wasn't fast enough, it spiraled into a tit-for-tat military shadow war involving oil tankers and drones, which finally culminated in the assassination of a major state figure and a barrage of ballistic missiles.
Yeah, and this 4-year period really serves as a masterclass in how rapidly complex international frameworks can unravel.
Absolutely.
It demonstrates that the geopolitical landscape is never static. When you apply immense pressure to one area, the system is going to buckle and bulge somewhere else.
And it provides such vital context for understanding the headlines we see today. For you listening, the core lesson here is that intense economic warfare, like the implementation of secondary sanctions that completely sever a country from the global financial operating system, it almost invariably bleeds into dangerous physical conflict.
It really does.
You cannot squeeze a state economically to the point of asphyxiation and just expect their pushback to remain purely on a spreadsheet.
Right, because economic coercion creates a massive pressure cooker. And if you seal all the valves, eventually the steam violently forces its way out.
Which leaves us with a final lingering question to ponder as you watch international relations continue to unfold today. When a nation's oil exports are driven toward absolute zero through maximum pressure, does it leave them with nothing left to lose?
That's the real question.
And if a state truly feels it has nothing left to lose economically, is it actually possible to deter them militarily?
It really highlights the ultimate paradox of leverage. Because if you take absolutely everything away from an adversary, you simultaneously destroy your own ability to threaten them with the loss of anything else.
Wow. We started this whole deep dive by talking about that concrete dam, the comfort of assuming that once an agreement is poured and set, the water will stay contained forever.
Yeah.
But the mechanics of this history show us that the geopolitical landscape doesn't respect concrete. The pressure builds, the structural integrity fails, and suddenly you aren't managing a dam anymore. You are just trying to survive the flood.